Now, the president of Sri Lanka took bold action to ban synthetic fertilizers. And there's a lot of effort by the World Economic Forum to encourage him and leaders of other countries to ban synthetic fertilizers because they contain nitrogen, basically, which is another greenhouse gas, right? Trapping, heat. He jumped into this agenda. He banned the use and importation of nitrogen-based fertilizers. Food production dropped by 50%. Prices increased 80%. Basically, millions of people in his country could not afford to buy most of the food they were used to. But I mean, the silver lining is that his country got a near perfect ESG score of 98%. So he got a great score of being environmentally friendly, and but his people were starving. So anyway, they kicked him out. Okay. Many asset managers and leading banks have committed to net zero by 2050, often through participation in United Nations-linked entities such as the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero and Climate Action 100. This is a statement by Nebraska State Treasurer John Moranti. When it comes to farmers and ranchers, how to get to net zero when using fertilizer, which is produced by natural gas, is extremely difficult, if not impossible. The policy of certain asset managers seems to be that farmers can continue growing food. They just can't use water or fertilizer to grow them. Okay, so you're free to grow the food, but you can't use any water and you can't use any fertilizer. He said the attack on farming has already begun here in America and, of course, countries like the Netherlands. Here we have an article, The Great Reset in Action. The Dutch government plans to shutter 3,000 farms. Heralds a new era for corporate control. So Dutch farmers are some of the most efficient and environmentally friendly farmers in the world, actually. I believe that they're second in the world after the United States in terms of exporting food, if I remember correctly. They're planning to force the sale and closure of 3,000 farms, and that's in order to meet strict new environmental guidelines put in place by the European Union. And they're offering what they consider to be generous terms of 120% of the farm's value. But the government is saying the purchaser will be mandated. We're going to offer you what we think is a good price for your farm, but we're taking you off that land whether you like it or not. And now think about this. These farmers have a lot of generational knowledge about farming, and so you're ripping them off their farms. I guess you're going to put them in cities and they can do some other kind of work. This is a really radical approach. Well, if you're getting rid of the farmers, well, where are you going to get your food from? Well, you're going to get fake food, basically. And that is a $3 trillion new industry. Once living animals are eliminated and replaced with patented plant-derived alternatives, private companies will effectively control the food supply in its entirety. And those who control the food control the people. There are various plant-based fake meat product, like it's called Beyond Beef. And there's something called the Impossible Burger. And some people are pointing out that the so-called Impossible Burger tests 11 times higher for glyphosate, which is used in weed killer. There are high rates of this chemical glyphosate, which can alter the function of more than 4,000 liver and kidney genes and cause organ damage. So again, they have these very ambitious plans to radically stop the creation of fossil fuels and use of nitrogen-based fertilizers in order to reduce CO2. But we don't know what the effects of humans eating this kind of fake meat, whether that's healthy or not. The chain of events. You start out with bans on fertilizers, which lead to rising costs for farmers and food shortages. That leads to price hikes, which leads to government price caps, which leads to less food being grown, which leads to government rationing, farms being sold, government and corporate takeovers, food lines, government subsidies, control of what and how much you eat. Now, the ironic thing about all of this is the nation of Russia has been covertly funding anti-fossil fuel groups for many, many years. According to the Guardian newspaper, NATO Secretary General Anders Rasmussen, who is also a former Prime Minister of Denmark, claimed in a presentation to a think tank in London, "I've met allies who can report that Russia, as part of their sophisticated information and disinformation operations, engaged actively with so-called non-governmental organizations, environmental organizations working against shale gas to maintain European dependence on imported Russian gas." Russia's been funding green groups in Europe. Their local development of natural gas sources will be reduced. So the European countries will be more dependent on Russian natural gas and oil. And also we see that China is building more than half of the world's new coal power plants. A year after President Xi Jinping promised China would stop building coal power plants overseas, the country has completed 14 such facilities and will finish another 27 soon. And that was reported in September of 2022. China emits more than 29% of the world's tonnage of carbon dioxide, said to cause global warming, double that of the United States. Now, look, if the environmental movement really believed that use of fossil fuel energy from coal power plants is really an existential threat to the world, right? Then, if they really believe that, then why aren't they saying anything about China building all these new coal power plants? Not just in China, but also all over the world, actually. And actually, I don't blame China. By the way, I don't blame China for doing this, because they want their people to have enough energy. The hypocrisy is amazing. If the environmental groups really believe that this is an existential threat, they would be burning down Chinese embassies all over the world. But they're not doing that. As we said before, Germany dismantling the wind farms so they can expand the coal mines. They're shutting down their nuclear power plants, which it makes no sense because nuclear power does not create any carbon dioxide whatsoever. What is the real agenda here? I believe it's to end the energy independence of the West. Maybe it's based on this guilt. In the case of people like Greta Thunberg, they think the wealth that we have, we rape the earth and we're using this dirty energy, and therefore we should suffer. We should, and they don't really understand how much energy is needed for a modern society to operate. Now, There are a number of other researchers, climate scientists, environmentalists, economists, who have actually looked at the data. And for instance, in this case, Bjorn Lomborg, who says that we're safer from climate disasters than ever before. Though it receives little mention from activists or the media, weather-related deaths have fallen dramatically. So if you look in the graph, you can see that there are nearly 500,000 climate-related deaths in the 1920s. I believe that's per year. You can see it dropping, each decade dropping, and until you can see that the climate-related deaths have fallen dramatically. And part of that is that we're building stronger buildings which do not get destroyed when there's a hurricane. So very few people are dying. Actually, in Florida, there aren't that many deaths when there's a hurricane, whereas in poor countries, a lot of people may die. All right, let me go to the next example. Michael Schellenberger wrote a book called Apocalypse Never: Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All. He's been an environmental activist for over 30 years. He helped save nuclear reactors around the world, thereby preventing increase in air pollution, equivalent to adding over 24 million cars to the road. In the 1990s, he helped save California's last unprotected ancient redwood forest. And he's been very active in Rwanda, saving various natural species. And just take a look at the photo in the middle. There are people in Africa who still have to carry heavy loads on top of their head. And with better roads and vehicles, then these kids could be going to school instead of having to work all day to support their families. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. And I'll give one more example. This is a book by Alex Epstein called Fossil Future: Why Global Human Flourishing Requires More Oil, Coal, and Natural Gas, Not Less. He writes, fossil fuels are still the dominant source of energy around the world. Renewables are causing skyrocketing electricity prices, increased blackouts. Fossil fuel development has brought global poverty to an all-time low. Climate-related deaths are at all-time lows thanks to fossil fuel development. So, if you really want to help poor people around the world, you should want them to have access to fossil fuel energy. Now, here we see these were private jets at the World Economic Forum meeting in 2016. And you have hundreds of private jets. These were, I guess, the movers and shakers. There were 400 private jets. Just look at this photo for a second. Do you think that global warming or climate change is really an emergency? Look at those private jets, which using obviously huge amounts of fossil fuel for just a few people. That's what a private jet's about, right? Do you think they're very concerned about global warming? I don't think so. And if so, there's obviously hypocrisy here. Okay, so here we have the mansion, the $12 million mansion purchased by Barack and Michelle Obama on Martha's Vineyard. It doesn't look like they're very concerned about the threat of rising sea levels predicted by Al Gore. Now, Obama did commit the U.S. to Paris Climate Agreement, which said that there was a climate emergency, but their mansion is very close to the Atlantic, the seashore there. It doesn't look like they're very worried about the rise in sea level. I guess we should look at what people do, not what they say. So then there's the situation with the Biden administration. In November, issued a permit for Chevron Corporation license that would allow this huge oil company to pump oil in Venezuela, whereas it's trying to limit the production of new oil permits and gas permits here in the United States. Ironically, the crude oil in Venezuela is far less environmentally friendly than U.S. oil. It has a higher sulfur content, and it doesn't make any sense. I guess the only thing I could say is that apparently fossil fuels in a communist country is good and fossil fuel in the United States is bad. Something like that. Al Gore and Google have backed a satellite database to track individual emitters of CO2. Mark Morano, publisher of Climate Depot, and a former senior staffer on the Senate Environmental Public Works Committee, he said, "This is a way for climate activists, the United Nations, and government bureaucrats to control every aspect of industrial society by monitoring and penalizing producers." Apparently, they are able to track the emissions of CO2 throughout the entire world. Now, this is really interesting. Bjorn Lomborg, the Danish economist, he's done projections. He said that based on data from the United Nations, without global warming, the average person in 2100 would be 450% better off than today. With global warming means that people will only be 434% richer instead. Okay? That is not a disaster. He's pointing out that the impact of so-called global warming is very, very manageable. I mean, he actually believes there is some warming. Actually, it's actually not really causing huge problems. It's not a catastrophe. It's not an existential threat. It's something that we can deal with, basically. So if you want to help the world's poor people, you should want to increase their access to cheap, clean, reliable energy. And if you want to help the world's environment, you should want to increase the access to cheap, clean, reliable energy. Okay, so that's the end of chapter 4. Okay.